Abuse and exploitation is not new in communities, but are issues preferably not discussed, whether it's cyber abuse, verbal, emotional, sexual or physical abuse. But not just in women and children, but also men and transgender persons. The sad thing is most of these crimes are not reported because victims are fearful of re-victimization, stigma and being ostracized. Authorities too have little awareness on how to deal with victims. Armed with an LLM and a background in human rights, Sashi Shafter decided to take the bull by the horns. She founded Esther and has begun her first steps in dealing with abuse and exploitation, engaging with stakeholders from law enforcement and authorities to victims themselves to create awareness on how these issues should be dealt with, the rights of victims and the legal provisions in place. Here she is on Selinco Life. Let's talk. I first asked Sashi, how far beyond the physical aspect does abuse and exploitation go?
There are several different types of abuse and exploitation: mental, verbal, emotional, and these are sometimes not captured in the law. There is a disproportionate focus on physical abuse, but actually studies show that the other types of abuse can be just as, if not more, damaging in some cases.
So there's a huge gap between the victim and the access to law. Access to justice is almost a near impossibility. How can this gap be addressed?
There are several factors that limit the access to justice. A lack of awareness of the legal provisions which exist is one of them. So by creating awareness of the legal provisions which are there to protect people, access to justice might be increased.
So how do we create that awareness?
So through Esther, I'm planning to organize a variety of workshops and even training programs. One thing that I'm really passionate about is increasing sensitivity training amongst the authorities, because sometimes when victims do go to make a police complaint, they end up being re-victimized because of a lack of awareness on the issues which exist and how to deal with them in a sensitive way, which does not traumatize victims further.
So what is our law like when it actually comes to dealing with varied areas of abuse and exploitation? How progressive are we?
There is always room for improvement, not only here but everywhere, I think, and that's because the world adapts and changes so rapidly that the law has to usually change to keep up with these social and cultural changes. Sri Lanka does have a lot of good provisions which do protect our citizens, and I think in 2005 we unanimously passed an act to protect our citizens from domestic violence. That was a huge positive step. But with regard to that and other issues, there is still room, and there are gaps in the law which hopefully will be filled moving forward.
What about cyber abuse and exploitation? It's a new area, and are there enough laws here to cover that?
So that's an interesting one, because currently we do have provisions in our penal code which are used to combat cyber exploitation. But I think, and this is the general consensus amongst NGOs and activists, there is a need for more specific legislation to more effectively combat cybercrime and cyber harassment, cyberbullying, all of these things. So although right now we can use provisions of the penal code, more specific legislation would offer better protection for all victims.
So you mentioned re-victimization of the victim, that is in the process of the reporting process. However, we as citizens are also guilty of re-victimizing victims because when it comes to communities, societies, we tend to be judgmental. How can we change that culture?
That's a very important question. I think that's where there's a huge gap between the law and the reality. And so many people are not even affected by changes in the law because of, like you said, cultural and social norms. Victim blaming is so common here, and that's where all these other facets of life come in, because even things like the media can be hugely influential in combating attitudes towards women, attitudes towards abuse, attitudes towards violence. And there are several studies, even in India, which have shown that there was a decrease in domestic violence after positive portrayals and portrayals of women being empowered in TV shows. So there are things which you wouldn't even think of. NGOs would think of only that being one sphere, but there are so many other ways that culture can be changed. But I think the most important thing is for everyone, regardless of their job, regardless of which sphere they operate in, to do their part in challenging these harmful social norms. So if you see someone who is being treated badly, say something, stand up for them, and kind of be bold enough to challenge that. Because if we don't challenge that kind of behavior, then it will never change. And people who do behave in that way will be, if they're never challenged, they'll just continue. And they'll be empowered by your silence, actually.
Don't empower those who are violent or abusive with your silence. Be bold, take a stand, and speak out. Sage words indeed from Sashi Shafter, the founder of Esther, on Selinco Live. Let's talk.
With Selinco Life Pension Saver, Sri Lanka's premier retirement plan, start planning for your retirement today. Selinco Life, a relationship for life.